welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to make the perfect pastry. Now in my eyes, there is nothing better than pastry. That is actually my weakness. I can eat so much of it. But I'm going to show you a little twist. I'm going to show you two versions. Now one of them is called a short crust pastry, and that's really versatile because it's not necessarily sweet, so you can actually use it for savoury things as well, such as quiche or pies or anything. And then the other one is a sweet pastry, which I actually prefer, but it's a little more technical to make. Anyway, I'm going to start with a short crust. Now this is such a simple recipe and you don't even need a mixer, you can do it all by hand. So for this, we're going to need 200 grams of plain flour, 100 grams of unsalted butter that's been out the fridge for about half an hour, 1 egg, a pinch of salt, and about 5 grams of caster sugar, and a little bit of vanilla extract. Now the vanilla is optional. I'm adding that because I'm going to do sweet things with it later, but you don't have to add it if you're going to use it for savoury. So to start, we're going to put the flour straight into a bowl, along with the sugar, the salt, and the butter. And I'm going to go in with my fingers because I'm going to mix it with my hands. And what I'm going to do is, rather than just mix it around, I'm going to create an almost sand-like consistency and mix it through my fingers and crumbling the mixture. So I'm rubbing the butter and flour in between my fingers using my thumbs. I'm going to do this until a sand-like consistency forms. So again, the best way is to pick up the mixture and then use your thumb to kind of rub it in between your fingers, and you'll get that consistency a lot quicker. If the butter's too soft, it will just become kind of a mess. If it's too hard, I find this impossible to do. So I leave the butter out the fridge, for about 15 to 30 minutes, just so it's softened slightly. Okay, so it's now formed that sand-like consistency, and as you can see, there's not really any lumps of flour left. It's all been mixed in, and the crumbs are all quite fine. I'll leave that to the side and just quickly wash my hands. So I've got the crumb consistency to the side, and now I'm going to add the egg. So what I'm going to do is actually weigh the egg into a bowl, because you're going to want actually 60 grams of egg. Now that's officially a large egg, but sometimes they're slightly less. So if they are less, you just want to add a touch of water to make it 60 grams. So this egg has weighed 55 grams, so I'm just going to add a splash of water to make it 60. Okay, so that's got to 60, and now I'm going to add my vanilla extract. So I use a paste for vanilla just because I think the flavour's better in it. And I'll mix that through with the egg, and this then goes into the bowl of flour and butter. And now it's time to get messy. So you just want to mix the egg through, and then eventually a dough will form. So a nice dough is formed. And before I put it into the fridge to chill, I'm just going to use the heel of my hand and push it along the surface. And this just ensures that all the butter is mixed in. And I believe this process is called frasering the dough. You want to do it about 6 to 7 times, no more. To gather the dough up, I'm going to get some cling film, because this now needs to set in the fridge. Now rather than cling filming a ball like this, actually going to lay it out flat. So get a nice bit of cling film, put the dough on, and then push it down. And the reason why we do this is so that it cools evenly and it's the same temperature throughout. Now if you put a ball of dough in the fridge, the inside won't be as cool as the outside. So if it's flat like this, it will cool down really nicely. That now will go into the fridge for about 20 minutes until it's nice and chilled. So I've just taken the shortcrust pastry out of the fridge. It's nice and firm. So I'm just going to unwrap it. And before you start rolling it out, you just want to knead it together. And that, again, just makes sure that the temperature is even throughout the dough. So just a quick knead. You don't want to knead it too much because otherwise the gluten develops too much and gets too tough. Just a little roll around and form it into a ball shape, just because it makes life a lot easier when you're lining a round tart tin. Now this tart tin is about 8 inches across, I believe, and this is enough dough for that. So with your flour, rather than dotting it on the surface like this, because you end up actually getting patches of flour, you want to throw it across, and that gives you a very even coverage of flour. So that's a good tip for you. And then put the dough down and put a bit more flour on the top. Now dust your rolling pin just with a little bit of flour, just to make sure it doesn't stick to the dough. And then start rolling. Now the best way to do this is to push it forwards and backwards about 5 times, and then turn it. And as you turn it, just give it a wipe around the flour too, just so it doesn't stick to the surface, because you just don't want that to happen. Then give it another roll, and turn it again. And you want to keep doing this until a larger circle is formed, so about 2 inches larger than the actual tin, and it's also really thin. And you want it as thin as possible. Now that doesn't mean so thin that it actually starts breaking, but thin pastry is key. So you're looking for about 3 to 4 millimeters thick. I'll give this one last roll into shape. And the way to test that it's even as well is run your fingers and thumbs over this dough, and you can feel if there are any thick bits around. But this actually feels fairly even. So just double check the size with the tart case. That looks good. I might roll it slightly more here. Check again. There we go, that's better. So you've got this kind of edge around the tart case, which is what you want. Now, get your rolling pin, and you want to roll the pastry back onto the rolling pin, like this. Keep it there, then move the tart tin in front of the dough, lift up the pastry, and gently unroll it so it falls back onto the tart tin. Now what you want to do is make sure that the corners of the tart tin are filled. So lift the pastry up and almost tuck it into the corners. If you don't do this, during the cooking in the oven, it will shrink. So you want it as close to the corner as possible. So I'm just lifting it up and putting it down. And just to ensure that it's really tucked in, I'm going to tear off a little bit of pastry, squash it into a ball, dip it into some flour, and now go around the edges and pushing the dough in. And that really ensures that it's right up to the edge. So nearly there. The last thing I'm going to do is just poke the bottom with holes using a fork. And this is going to prevent the pastry from rising up when it's cooking. So hopefully it will stay nice and flat. Okay, so that is going to go back into the fridge for another 10 minutes for it to cool in the tart tin before we put it in the oven. So the pastry's just come out of the fridge, nice and firm. Now before we line it with our baking beans, I'm actually going to trim off all this excess dough, and just makes a cleaner edge. I know people do that after it's cooking, but I think it's not as neat, and I've got a little bit of OCD, so I do this now. So I'm just going to use my rolling pin, kind of cut into it, and then just roll it along the tart tin, and it will push off all that excess dough. And there's something really therapeutic about it too. Take all this away. and I just give it one last extra pinch in the corners just to make sure it's really, really tightly fitted. Okay, so now this is ready for the oven, but you can't just put it in like this, otherwise the sides will fall down and the middle will rise up. So we actually do something called blind bake it. Now for this, you need either baking beans, which are actually made of clay and they weigh this paper down, or you can use dried beans and rice and things like that. So you can just put this straight in, but I've got a trick that makes it really, really snug. And you literally just scrunch this up. So scrunch it up as tight as you can. And when you undo it, like this, it's a lot more almost flexible. So you can really get into the corners. So the reason why you want to get into the corners so much is that you don't want the sides of the pastry to sink downwards. Just make it nice and snug. And now I can go in with my baking beans. So just tip the whole lot on. Spread them out evenly, especially into the corners. And now we're good to go. So I'm going to put this in the oven, which is at 180 degrees, for about 15 minutes. I'm then going to check to see if the sides are cooking nicely. And once they're starting to brown, I'm going to take the tin out, remove the beans, and then continue to cook it until it's completely cooked through. So this has been in the oven for about 15 minutes, and I can see that the edges of the tart are beginning to brown and cook really nicely, which means it's time to take the baking beans off. Now they are hot, so be careful. I've got my pot ready, and I'm just going to scoop this up in the baking paper and pour them directly in the pot. Now, if you're going to fill another tart with these, just make sure that they're completely cool again, otherwise it will start melting the pastry before it goes in the oven. Now, as you can see, the tart has really kept its shape, which is perfect. This just needs a further 5 to 10 minutes in the oven so the pastry completely dries out, and in Mary Berry terms, there are no soggy bottoms. So for the sweet pastry, I'm actually using a stand mixer for this. You can use a handheld whisk if you want, but I'm using the stand mixer with a beater attachment. And to make the sweet pastry, I need 200 grams of plain flour, 125 grams of softened butter, 50 grams of caster sugar, 1 egg, which is 50 grams, pinch of salt. I'm gonna zest half a lemon, and I've got some vanilla extract. Now into the mixer bowl, I'm going to put the butter and sugar and then cream it together. So the butter's softened. And it goes. And along with the caster sugar. And I'm going to beat that together until it's light, fluffy and creamy. So as you can see, that's really lightened up, it's nice and fluffy. Now I'm just going to scrape the sides of the bowl down, just to make sure it's all mixed in. I'm going to add the egg. Now what might happen here is that it will start to curdle, but don't worry, you can just add a tablespoon of flour and it will come together better. Okay, so I can see it splitting slightly, so I'm just going to get some of my flour and add it to the bowl. Perfect. Now I can go directly in with the rest of the flour, the salt, the vanilla paste, just for a little kick of flavour, and then the zest of just half a lemon. And I find this really, really complements any filling that you fill the sweet pastry with. So I'll give that a final mix on a low to medium speed. And you want to mix it until it's just combined. So as you can see, it's all combined, and you're probably thinking like, oh my gosh, that's really soft, how is that pastry? But don't worry, this sits in the fridge like the short crust, and then actually becomes really nice to work with. So I'm just scraping the excess off the beater. Just give it one final mix with my hand. And again, get some cling film. This time, just spoon the mixture onto the cling film and wrap it up and squash it flat, again, so the temperature is even throughout. So this needs to cool in the fridge for slightly longer than the short crust pastry, so I'm going to leave it for about 20 to 30 minutes until it's nice and firm. So I've just taken the sweet pastry out the fridge and I left it in there slightly longer, and so it's gone really nice and hard. And I'm actually going to line these smaller tins, which are these really cute little tart cases. And I feel that sweet pastry is a lot better to line smaller tins like this rather than short crust pastry. So if you're going for smaller tins, use the sweet. So as I'm doing 4 individual tins, I'm going to divide the dough into 4. And then just like the short crust, I'm going to massage it so the temperature becomes even, and I can already feel the difference. This goes a lot softer, a lot quicker, and it's actually a lot easier to roll out. So again, just sprinkle the surface with flour and on top of the dough and roll the dough out. Turn. And seeing as this is a lot stickier than the short crust pastry, you can always just top up with flour to make sure it doesn't stick to your rolling pin. You can even flip the dough, because it doesn't matter if the bottom is covered in flour. So you can actually roll this dough out really thinly. If it cracks, you can just push it back together. And it's actually a lot easier to shape as well, so it fits in tighter corners, such as the smaller tart tins. So I'm going to do the same as what I did with the short crust, but because it's a small tin, I'm not going to put it on the rolling pin. I'm just going to do it with my hands. But I'm just going to drop the pastry inside and then push it against the sides to line the tin. And you can actually see how thin the pastry is because you can start to see the black coming through, but that's absolutely fine. You just don't want it too thin so it breaks. Again, get some of the excess dough, put it into some flour and just push it against the corners just to make sure it's completely squashed in there. Again, prick the base with a fork to stop it rising. So that's all of them done. I'm now going to chill them in the fridge until the pastry is nice and cool, so that's another 10 minutes or so. I'm going to preheat the oven to 180 degrees Celsius, ready for the tarts to be cooked in. And also, if you've got any leftover dough such as this, you can actually squash it together and reuse it. So I'm going to put this into some cling film and use it later on. You can't really do that with a short crust pastry because it gets too tough, but the sweet pastry is really good to reuse. So the tart case is done. I've left it to cool completely after it's come out of the oven. It's nice and dry, perfectly baked, and it hasn't shrunken too much away from the side either. Now with the small sweet pastry, I've done exactly the same process. So just before the oven, I trimmed off the excess, blind baked it, and they've come out nice and even too. And now it's just time to compare the two. So what I do with the large tart cases particularly is I actually leave them in the tin until all the filling's in and then take it out, just because they're quite fragile. Now I'll show you with the smaller cases that, look how perfectly lined that case was. So it's come out really easily. These are actually non-stick tins as well. I'll put all the links below for where I get all my tart tins, but you can really see that it's got this real sharp edge of the pastry, and it smells really tasty. I'm actually really tempted to try a bit. Okay, well, I mean, don't tell anyone, but you can hear like the sound of how crispy the pastry is, and it's so thin as well. And the sweet pastry is obviously sweeter, but it almost tastes like a biscuit. Now imagine that filled with like lemon curd or just fresh fruit and cream. Really, really delicious. So see what one you prefer. I prefer using short crust for sweeter fillings, such as lemon meringue pie, or savoury fillings, such as quiche, but I use the sweet tarts mainly for fruit and just to enhance sweetness where possible. I hope you've enjoyed watching me compare the two pastries, short crust and sweet. Give them a go, see what you think. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe to my channel, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.